After Halo 3's first couple of levels, I was a little worried. I don't particularly dislike Sierra 117 or Crow's Nest, but after Halo 2 took a less expansive approach to level design than Combat Evolved did before it, their focus on-foot combat in generally smaller environments did leave me on edge. What I wanted was the refinements made to Halo's sandbox in 2 combined with the openness of the original, and until I arrived at Tsavo Highway, I wasn't entirely sure that was what I was going to get. Thankfully, Halo 3's third mission put my mind completely at ease. Before we talk about why, first a quick rundown of what happened prior to the beginning of Tsavo Highway. After plummeting to Earth and landing in the Tanzanian jungle, Master Chief is met by Sergeant Johnson, the Arbiter, and a squad of Marines. The group begin their trek to an extraction point, but are forced to take a detour after Johnson is captured by the Covenant, although it doesn't take too long for them to rescue him. Jumping on board Pelicans and heading to nearby base the Crow's Nest, Fleet Admiral Hood and Miranda Keyes outline their plan to prevent the Covenant from activating an artifact housed in New Mombasa, which they are concerned could be used to fire the Halo array, in the process eradicating all life in the galaxy. As the briefing continues, the base comes under attack and Chief has little choice but to destroy it, after which he begins his escape using a set of tunnels as Tsavo Highway begins. As you take control, Miranda Keyes radios in with instructions on where to head next.
Chief, please respond. What is your status? Over. If you can hear me, find transport. Head to the town of...
Before we really get into the swing of things, it's worth noting that right after making your way outside and a few more times during the level, there are optional snippets of dialogue that are very easily missed. If you head to the cliff edge and survey the wreckage of the New Mombasa orbital elevator, you'll get a few lines from the Marines travelling with you.
New Mombasa space elevator.
It collapsed when the city got glassed.
But the tether was thousands of kilometers high.
Yeah? Well, now it's scattered all over the savannah.
And if you do similar towards Tsavo Highway's conclusion, you'll again be given some additional information.
Commander, I can see most of it now. Readings are all over the EM spectrum.
Roger that, Recon. Shutter your gear, pull back. I'll monitor from Kilo 2-3.
There are a few other places you can hear extra lines too, like over the radio inside the downed Phantom, also near the start. It's nothing major, but they're nice bits of colour added to a mission which isn't at all story heavy. Speaking of story, now is a good time to also chat further about how Tsavo Highway fits into Halo 3's campaign. It's a strange one. Some of you might have seen my video on Exodus in Halo Reach, which I think is quite unique, as you could remove it from the game, connect the missions on either side of it, and the story would still make total sense. It's very much a standalone experience. Tsavo Highway is very similar. There isn't a huge amount to take in story terms, and you could absolutely pluck it from 3's campaign, connect Crow's Nest before it and the Storm after it with an extra line of dialogue or two, and everything would add up. In a way, this makes its inclusion a bit of a shame, as Sierra 117 and Crow's Nest don't move the story forward a whole lot, and then you're confronted by Tsavo Highway, which does far less than either. With Halo 3's narrative already feeling rushed at times, I question whether Bungie dedicating a whole level which amounts to little more than a transition between much more important story beats was worth it. Tsavo Highway's premise then may be a relatively simple one. It's about taking a journey from A to B, but in that respect it delivers in spades. Much of it is still quite linear, especially towards its opening, but every so often the level design blossoms out to accommodate larger scale encounters both on foot and in vehicles, which gives it a lovely ebb and flow I don't think is present as much during the missions leading up to it. It keeps a fast pace, but a consistent one, and because there are few, if any, interruptions across its runtime, it's really enjoyable to revisit for a 15 to 20 minute blast of much of what Halo's sandbox has to offer. Other than the briefest of holdouts against brutes at its midway point, you never have to slow down for too long, and that ensures Tsavo Highway's gameplay aligns well with its context too. You feel like you're on a journey throughout. Detractors might argue that the Ark does the same thing later in the campaign, but with more variety and over an extended period of time, but viewed at anything other than surface level, they are quite different. That being said, there is one issue with the idea of it being a journey, an ever-present one in the franchise, and that is the friendly AI when they take control of a vehicle. Getting things going using a section in a Warthog was certainly a brave decision, given your allies' pathfinding can be a tad wonky at times. It works for the most part and isn't as frustrating as one or two other infamous examples, but woe betide anyone whose Warthog gets stuck on the minutest of rocks, as if that does happen, you ain't going nowhere. The Brute Chopper makes its big debut in the second, more spacious area you arrive at.
I repeat, my convoy's been hit. I've got wounded. We're on the Tsavo Highway about east of Void. Someone, anyone, please respond.
You've never encountered one before, and so Bungie uses a short scripted moment to clearly illustrate its strengths, and that it is not a vehicle to be trifled with. This last encounter, up until you clear the drones and a path forward, is what I consider to be Tsavo Highway's halfway mark, at which point the training wheels are ready to come off. You've indulged in some relatively stress-free driving and shooting, you've been introduced to the Brute Chopper, and you've had the opportunity to fight the Covenant across a couple of arenas that are open, but not too open. None of it may seem like anything exciting, but that's sort of the point. Sierra 117 and Crow's Nest are all about on-foot combat, but the Storm, which comes after Tsavo Highway, is fairly reliant on you being competent with vehicles given its big Scarab set piece. Halo veterans will be able to breeze through things fairly easily, but it also gives those new to the series a chance to get to grips with fighting and taking advantage of vehicles before proceedings get significantly more complex after. The level's second half and the switch from simple to a touch trickier occurs as a Covenant battlecruiser passes overhead.
Commander, this is only Recon 111. The cruiser's above. They found me.
Say again, Recon? You're breaking up.
Something in the crater, ma'am. Something beneath the storm.
Your attention will likely be drawn to the sweeping vista in the distance, and what a gorgeous view it is too. The Forerunner artifact sitting in the middle of an enormous crater, the gigantic cloud hanging in the sky above it. It may not be the most lively background and skybox in Halo 3, but it is for my money perhaps the most striking. It's an ever-present sight as you traverse the highway and makes events more atmospheric than I think they would have been otherwise, and at the same time adds further scale to a mission which doesn't feel as grand in story terms. Everything from this point onwards is awesome, with the next encounter one I've always been particularly fond of. I just love how it's designed. The area is pretty big for an on-foot firefight, but the placement of enemies means you'll likely find yourself navigating it exactly as Bungie intended. First, you battle the group of enemies in the middle of it, and as you thin their ranks, your attention will be drawn towards more of them charging down the hill. If you don't naturally end the encounter at the top of the hill after, any Marines left will head up there themselves, and following them you'll find everything you need to hold off the reinforcements which soon arrive in a Phantom. The layout of the area is also brilliant in that it gives you long sight lines for the sniper rifle you might choose to equip yourself with, but equally there's plenty of cover should you decide to get up close and personal. From entering the area to taking out the last of the Covenant's backup, you never slow down for a second as you weave between buildings and wreckage while trying to keep tabs on the brutes equipped with jetpacks flying through the air. It really shows off how it's still possible to fashion a dynamic, pacey, on-foot encounter in a space larger than would normally be used in most shooters. It's one of the endless examples I could cite within the Halo trilogy of Bungie truly being masters of their craft. As Punch Through, a variation of Halo's theme, swells, you take on another group of brute choppers before you enter the mission's largest encounter. By this point, you may have fought a lot of choppers, but it's far less likely you've had the opportunity to pilot one, so Bungie places a couple just prior to it on a road guarded by only a pair of brutes. During my playthroughs, I used a hijacked Wraith and a Warthog, but it makes sense that you're given the opportunity to both fight and pilot a chopper, so that by the end of Tsavo Highway, you're completely familiar with how they function. As mentioned during the introduction, when I first played Halo 3 after Sierra 117 and Crow's Nest, I was worried that the game's level design was going to be more in the mould of 2's, which at times felt very narrow. My fears weren't immediately assuaged when playing Tsavo Highway either. Some of its early sections are very reminiscent of parts of 2, for example Uprising, where you get to pilot a vehicle but are kept on a restricted path that rarely opens up much. Even at the end of the level I wasn't completely convinced, but over time I've changed my opinion. I think in many ways Bungie takes elements of both 2 and Combat Evolved's vehicle sections and merges them to create something quite fantastic. They retain some of the linearity of 2's vehicle portions, but don't go overboard with it to the point you feel stifled. Equally, they have more of the openness of Combat Evolved's offerings, but dial it back somewhat so that the pace remains higher than it did at times during Halo's maiden outing. What you end up with, and this is something you see a lot during the rest of Halo 3 too, are these wonderful circular areas which give you room to breathe but aren't so big that the level's pace ever slows down too much. Here, brute choppers are constantly charging at you and wraiths fire balls of plasma at you from a distance, but throughout all of it, you're able to manage the chaos and are then swiftly shepherded onto your next challenge. In Combat Evolved, you might have had a bit of downtime, maybe too much. In 2, you may never have got the open space to begin with, whereas Tsavo Highway and much of 3 finds a perfect medium between them. The last encounter or two with the brutes I'm not so keen on. They're fine enough, there's obviously nothing wrong with them, but they also lack the excitement of practically everything else preceding them. For all intents and purposes, they act as palate cleansers after the extended vehicle sequences you've just emerged from, but it also means Tsavo Highway has quite the down-tempo ending, with the cutscene which follows feeling much the same.
Marines, the Prophet of Truth doesn't know it yet, but he's about to get kicked right off his throne. You will take our city back and drive our enemy into the graves they've been so happily digging. One final effort is all that remains.
Tsavo Highway is an enjoyable affair which does a lot right, but at the same time when I reach the end of it, I always find myself questioning whether it really needed to be included. On the one hand, it's the first demonstration of Bungie finding the middle ground between Combat Evolved and 2's vehicle sequences, with encounters being pacey while remaining open. On the other, there's not a huge amount of story attached to it, and with the back half of Halo 3 feeling so rushed, an argument could definitely be made that it leaves the campaign treading water nearly a third of a way into its runtime, which isn't ideal in a title that already feels short. How much you appreciate it, then, I suppose comes down to how much you value story over gameplay, or vice versa. If you're more interested in how the trilogy's narrative unfolds, it's not going to be your go-to mission, but if you're somewhere in the middle or are all about gameplay, you'll always have a fantastic time playing Tsavo Highway. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments, and hopefully we'll cross paths again soon.